god, the goddess, the hero. But the most primal one of these archetypes, if you will, the most primal one that has features, that has personification, that is identifiable with features, is the trickster. The mother, the child, the shadow, those are the most basic, but they're all formless in terms of features, so that you can identify which who it is. The trickster is the first one that has facial features, and these are ascribed by indigenous cultures. They survive. The trickster survives into the modern world today. What do you do when you go out on Halloween? What do? You go out and go trick or treat.
Right.
Where do clowns come from? What is up with a stage magician who does sleight of hand? These are all surviving vestiges of trickster energy in the modern world. The trickster thrived for thousands of years in a matriarchal, pantheistic cultural system. In other words, before there were cities, before there were kings, before there was some sort of ruling authority, the trickster was a very vibrant part of indigenous culture.
Right, before there was monotheism.
And a switch from the matriarchy to a patriarchy, which is also very important.
Right.
A trickster is neither male or female. It's not good or bad. It's not black or white. It's not old or young. The trickster is something, I think I equate it as a 3,000-pound gorilla that is in every single person's living room, and it's drumming its toes on the coffee table. And, everybody is in denial that we have this amazingly powerful archetypal form that manifests every day in all of our lives. So if you look at the trickster as a marginalized figure who, when Christianity came along, the trickster, was awarded the designation of Satan, of Lucifer, of a devil, of a demon. They needed the trickster to be marginalized to become the bad guy.
Right.
So as a result, the trickster had to go into the closet. The trickster has been operating clandestinely, has been sneaking and peeking and scooting and shooting in culture, totally out of the limelight. And that's important to I think your listeners to realize. The trickster has been operative all the way through history, but it's been marginalized by Christianity as a bad guy, and other cultures as well. The jinn, the genies in Islamic traditions, is an example of Islam marginalizing the trickster and actually coming up with a very ingenious breakdown of trickster society,
right.
In terms of the genie. There's 12 main types. They all have kids. They have lifespans. Certain genies are responsible for certain types of tasks in herding and, cavorting with modern, fully incarnate human beings like you and I. So everywhere you go around the world, there are tricksters. And they all have different names. There's thousands of them. Each trickster is slightly different, but they all have a commonality. They all have the ability to shapeshift.
Well, I think your book is kind of unique in that you identify them all as such. I don't know if all of the beings and entities that you talk about in your book were necessarily thought of as tricksters before you wrote this book.
No, they weren't. One of the important things to remember is that classic anthropology really has only identified the trickster for 130 or 140 years. In other words, Daniel Brinton, when he coined the term trickster to kind of define this particular force within the culture, that was back in the 1870s. And when I tried to research where he first used the term, I couldn't find it.
Huh.
Which is very interesting to me because, how could it be any different? When was the trickster first defined? Well, the trickster won't let you know.
Right.
And classic anthropology has been stuck, in my opinion, in a rut. They have very emphatically said the trickster is not self-aware, it's unconscious, and it does not evolve. And to me, that's ludicrous. There's nothing within our Einsteinian or Newtonian universe that does not evolve.
Yeah.
And if that's true, if I can refute that particular assertion that the trickster does not evolve, then that means that there is some sort of process within the trickster archetype that is becoming self-aware. It can't be unconscious forever. If everything evolves, then it is evolving into awareness. Now, one of the things that's really important to remember about all trickster archetypes around the world that we all share on a deep, subcultural, subconscious level, or a collective unconscious level, I think it would be more appropriate. The trickster I think from continent to continent to continent, the trickster's primary role seems to be to topple static structures,
Yeah.
to supply novelty and change, to topple the powers that be. As soon as things get too entrenched, too set in stone, you know, you have the haves and the have-nots. The trickster comes in and pulls that key little thing out of the foundation to topple the house of cards.
Right.
It supplies novelty and change to create change within static structures. Now, the other thing that the trickster, in all versions, it boils down to supplying somehow technology or new understanding to humans. In other words, if you look at the trickster, you can divide it up into three different distinct types. You have the most primordial, the most basic trickster, which tends to be an anthropomorphized view of an animal that a particular subculture will think has tricksterous qualities. Coyote is the most famous and most obvious one for people in America.
Right.
Coyote and Roadrunner. Actually, Roadrunner is more of a trickster than Coyote. You know, Roadrunner always wins, so it out-tricksters the trickster, which I love. That's my favorite cartoon. Coyote is one. Raven, Spider, the Great Hare.
The Fox.
Well, Fox is one of those tricksters who only appears in a few pantheons of trickster forms, mainly Renaud, the famous fox trickster in France, whose claim to fame was poking fun at the Pope.
Right.
So I do identify with that particular form quite readily. So anyway, that's the primordial anthropomorphized trickster form. Those are the most ancient. They tend to change nature, the very essence of Gaia, for the benefit of man.
Okay.
Like Raven brought daylight into existence so man could grow crops.
Right.
The Kappa,
I love that story.
Yeah, the Maui Kappa is another one. They actually pushed the sun further up in the sky to help humankind. The smoking mirror in the Mayan or the South American tradition, or the Central American and Yucatan tradition. There's Iktomi, which is a Midwestern American spider version. He has an exact twin in Africa called Anansi. So these are animals that are given tricksterish qualities by a culture, and they are responsible for changing nature to benefit man. Now you go to the second of the three trickster types, and that is the tragic hero. These are the ones that I think most people are, at least in today's modern world, might be familiar with. Loki, the famous trickster from Scandinavia, definitely supplied technology. He supplied the fishing hook to humanity. These tragic hero figures tend to work in opposition to the gods. The first type of trickster doesn't have to deal with gods.
Right.
He deals with like a creator force, but not individual pantheistic gods. The tragic hero has to deal with god forms. So he brings technology to humans, but usually he does it in opposition to the gods' wishes and gets punished. Prometheus is probably the most famous of these tragic hero trickster forms. Prometheus was the Greek god that defied Zeus and brought fire to humanity, and as a punishment for transgressions, he was chained to a rock in the Carpathians, or I forget which mountains. And he had his liver pecked out by Zeus's eagle every day, and it would heal, and then the next day it would get pecked out, for eternity.
Why was
so
his
you have
liver?
The tragic hero type. Go ahead.
Why his liver? I always wondered that.
Well, the liver is, besides the heart, probably the most important. The lungs too. The heart, liver, and lungs are the most important organs. So the liver filters everything that we take in. So that is a good question. I need to think about that. Why not the lungs or the heart?
Yeah, no, that's kind of an aside, but I have always wondered why it was the liver and not, But anyhow,
I think out of the three major organs, harming your liver allows you to live the longest. If you harm the lungs, you die. If you harm the heart, you die. But the liver, you can survive. So it's probably the slow death scenario.
Gotcha. Well, so okay, we got the anthropomorphized animals, and then we got the tragic heroes, and what's number 3 here?
Number 3 would be the form of trickster I think that most people would be most readily able to identify with, or at least know about, and that is the shamanic trickster. It's a human that uses trickster methodology and tools to enact a tricksterish agenda. Now, the first two types are acting altruistically. They're kind of in a symbiotic relationship with humanity. They have no agenda. They don't realize what they're doing is good or bad. They don't realize they are, in some sense of the word, unconscious in that they're reactive to situations. They don't have any perceived agenda. Usually that agenda turns out positive for humanity. The third type of trickster, the shamanic trickster, is the first inkling of the trickster being able to express consciousness and have an idea, have an agenda. So shamans, for thousands of years, were direct conduits between individuals and divinity. It was only with the rise of urban culture, converting from a matriarchy to a patriarchy, that we see urban centers, kings arise in culture, at least in this current fourth world. And the shaman was marginalized and put in the background and only exists in real indigenous cultures because it was replaced by the priest class.
Right.
Now, the priest class, instead of being a conduit for your individual divinity, they're a gatekeeper or a doorman.
Right.
They say, you got to look like this or do that in order to have connection with some sort of divinity. So the priest class has supplanted the shaman. However, the shaman hasn't totally gone away. We have shaman in every continent. We have shamanic figures. And some of the more famous recent tricksters, I mentioned Michael Jackson, to me, has very tricksterous qualities. But my favorite is Bernie Madoff.
Yeah.
There you go. $6 billion. He very artfully, in a tricksterish manner.
Or it was $50 billion.
Well, 60, but who's counting?
Oh, 60. I thought you said 6. I'm sorry.
No, 60.
Yeah.
$60 billion he milked out of a lot of people that had a lot of greed and a lust for unreasonable returns on their investment. Houdini is another classic trickster. Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater group that did the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast. Aleister Crowley, probably, Dollars to Donuts, my favorite trickster figure.
Well, I definitely want to get into Aleister Crowley at a little bit of depth, for sure. I don't know